G'day, and welcome to the story of Australia's strangest battle. The year is 1932. The world is in the grip of the Great Depression, and Australia, a young nation carved from harsh landscapes, is feeling the strain. In the vast, sun-baked plains of Western Australia, life for farmers is tough. They battle droughts, floods, and pests. But nothing could prepare them for the enemy they are about to face. This is the story of the Great Emu War. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the globe. Australia, heavily reliant on agricultural exports, was hit hard. The price of wheat, a staple crop, plummeted. Farmers, already struggling, faced ruin. The government, desperate to boost the economy, urged farmers to grow more wheat. They promised subsidies, but the money never materialized. Farmers, burdened with debt and facing mounting losses, felt betrayed. As if the economic hardship wasn't enough, a new threat emerged from the outback emus. These flightless birds, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 100 pounds, are native to Australia. Every year, they migrate in large numbers, searching for food and water. In 1932, driven by drought, an estimated 20,000 emus descended upon the wheat fields of Western Australia. They feasted on the crops, trampled fences, and left behind a trail of devastation. The farmers had had enough. They demanded action from the government. Their pleas reached the ears of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense. A veteran of World War I, Pearce saw an opportunity. He agreed to send in the army, armed with Lewis machine guns, to combat the emu menace. The Great Emu War was about to begin. A land of promise, a time of despair, the aftermath of World War I. World War I had ended, leaving scars both visible and invisible on the Australian psyche. Returning soldiers, many forever changed by their experiences in the trenches, yearned for a fresh start. The government, eager to reward their service and to populate the vast expanse of Western Australia, offered them land. These parcels of land, carved from the untamed outback, held the promise of a new life. But the reality was harsher than many had imagined. The soil, dry and unforgiving, yielded meager crops. Water was scarce, and the elements were relentless. For many soldier settlers, the dream of becoming farmers turned into a struggle for survival. Seeds of discontent, the Great Depression's impact on rural Australia. The 1920s, a time of prosperity for many in the Western world, brought little relief to the struggling farmers of Western Australia. Then, in 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world spiraling into the Great Depression. Australia, heavily dependent on agricultural exports, was particularly vulnerable. The price of wheat, the lifeblood of many farming communities, plummeted. Farmers who had mortgaged their futures to purchase land and equipment found themselves drowning in debt. Banks foreclosed on farms, leaving families destitute and desperate. The social fabric of rural Australia began to fray. The government's gamble, a wheat quota, and broken promises. Faced with a growing economic crisis, the Australian government grasped for solutions. Their answer? Increase wheat production. They believed that flooding the market with Australian wheat would drive down prices for other countries and force them to buy from Australia, thereby boosting the national economy. Farmers were encouraged, even pressured, to plant more wheat. To sweeten the deal, the government promised subsidies to help offset the costs of increased production. Farmers, desperate for any lifeline, took the gamble. They planted more wheat, mortgaged their farms further, and prayed for a miracle. The miracle, however, never came. The subsidies, promised by a government struggling to stay afloat itself, never materialized. Farmers, already buried in debt, now faced a mountain of unsold wheat and a future that seemed bleaker than ever. As if the economic woes weren't enough, A new threat emerged from the heart of Australia: emus. These flightless birds, remnants of a prehistoric era, are a common sight in the Australian outback. Every spring, following ancient migratory patterns, they move inland to breed, their numbers swelling into the thousands. In 1932, driven by drought and lured by the abundant water and food sources created by the expansion of farmland, an estimated 20,000 emus descended upon the wheat belt of Western Australia. They devoured crops, trampled fences, and fouled water sources. The farmers, already grappling with economic ruin, now faced an avian invasion of unprecedented scale. The farmers, at their wits' end, turned to the government for help. They had answered the call to increase wheat production, only to be betrayed by broken promises and a global economic crisis. Now their livelihoods were being devoured by an enemy they were ill-equipped to fight: the emu. Their pleas, initially met with indifference, eventually reached the ears of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense. Pearce, a veteran of World War I and a man known for his decisive action, saw an opportunity. He would send in the army, armed with Lewis machine guns, to combat the emu menace. It was a decision that would have unintended consequences, forever etching the Great Emu War into the annals of Australian history. To understand the challenges faced by the Australian farmers and later, the Australian Army, we must first understand the emu. Standing up to 6 feet tall and weighing over 100 pounds, the emu is a formidable creature. Its powerful legs, each equipped with 3 sharp toes, can deliver a bone-breaking kick. Emus can sprint at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, and they can cover vast distances without tiring. Their feathers, loose and shaggy, provide excellent insulation from the harsh Australian sun and camouflage them in the dry scrubland. They are intelligent birds, capable of learning and adapting to their environment. The emus, driven by drought and lured by the abundance of food and water found on the newly established farms, descended upon the wheat belt like a feathered plague. They devoured the ripening grain, leaving behind barren patches in their wake. Their powerful legs trampled fences, allowing rabbits and other pests to further damage the crops. The emus also fouled water sources, making them unusable for livestock and further exacerbating the already dire situation. The farmers, their livelihoods hanging by a thread, watched in dismay as their hard work and hopes for the future were devoured by the relentless birds. The farmers, their patience worn thin by years of hardship and broken promises, grew increasingly frustrated with the government's inaction. They had answered the call to increase wheat production, only to be abandoned when the promised subsidies failed to materialize. Now they were facing a new enemy, one that seemed immune to their traditional methods of control. Shooting the emus proved largely ineffective. The birds, scattered across a wide area, were difficult to target, and their thick feathers provided surprising protection from shotgun blasts. Poisoning was considered, but it was a risky proposition, as it could also harm livestock and wildlife. The farmers felt trapped, their livelihoods held hostage by a force they could not control. In a last-ditch effort to save their farms and their way of life, a delegation of farmers traveled to Perth, the capital of Western Australia, to plead their case directly to the government. They brought with them photographic evidence of the emu damage, their stories of hardship, and a simple request: military intervention. The farmers argued that the emus, like enemy soldiers, posed a threat to the nation's well-being. They pointed out that many of them were veterans of World War I, skilled in the use of firearms, and they requested the government supply them with weapons and ammunition to combat the emu menace. The farmers' plea reached the desk of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense. Pearce, a veteran himself and a man known for his decisiveness, faced a difficult decision. On the one hand, deploying the military against a flock of birds seemed, on the surface, absurd. On the other hand, the farmers' plight was dire, and their request, however unusual, came from a place of genuine desperation. After much deliberation and perhaps influenced by the potential propaganda value of a military victory, however unconventional, Pearce agreed to the farmers' request. The Australian Army would be sent to wage war on the emus. The decision, met with a mixture of amusement and incredulity by the public, would have unintended consequences, forever etching the Great Emu War into the annals of Australian history. The Australian government's decision to deploy the army against the emus was met with a mix of amusement and skepticism by the public, but for the farmers of Western Australia, it was a glimmer of hope in desperate times. In early November 1932, a detachment of soldiers from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery, led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, arrived in the Wheat Belt, armed with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission to engage and destroy the emu enemy, thereby saving the wheat harvest and restoring a sense of order to the embattled region. The soldiers, veterans of World War I, were no strangers to combat, but they soon discovered that fighting emus presented unique and unexpected challenges. The soldiers' initial attempts to engage the emus proved frustratingly ineffective. Their World War I-era tactics, designed for trench warfare and large-scale battles, were ill-suited to the vast, open expanses of the Australian outback and the unpredictable movements of their avian adversaries. The emus, far from behaving like a traditional enemy force, proved to be masters of evasion and guerrilla warfare. They scattered at the first sign of danger, their natural camouflage making them difficult to spot in the dry scrubland. Their speed and agility, far exceeding the soldiers' expectations, allowed them to easily outrun and outmaneuver the lumbering military vehicles. Even when hit by bullets, the emus often continued running, their thick feathers and tough hides providing surprising protection. Major Meredith, a career military man, found himself increasingly frustrated by the emus' unorthodox tactics. They refused to engage in open combat, preferring instead to harass the soldiers with hit-and-run attacks on the wheat fields. The emus seemed to anticipate the soldiers' movements, vanishing into the scrubland just as the Lewis guns were brought to bear. The soldiers, their morale waning with each passing day, began to question the wisdom of their mission. They had faced down enemy soldiers in the trenches of Europe, but they were ill-prepared for the challenges of waging war on a creature that seemed to defy both logic and military strategy. One of the most memorable, and for the soldiers, humiliating, engagements of the Great Emu War took place at a watering hole near the town of Campion. Major Meredith, having received intelligence that a large flock of emus had gathered in the area, decided to lay an ambush. He positioned his men and their Lewis guns on a ridge overlooking the watering hole, hoping to catch the birds off guard. As the emus, their numbers estimated in the thousands, approached the watering hole, the soldiers held their fire, their fingers itching on the triggers. When the birds were within range, Meredith gave the order to fire. The Lewis guns roared, but the result was far from what Meredith had anticipated. The emus, startled by the sudden barrage, scattered in all directions, their movements chaotic but surprisingly effective. The soldiers, their guns hampered by jams and their aim thrown off by the birds' erratic movements, inflicted minimal casualties. The emus, having learned a valuable lesson about the dangers posed by men with guns, quickly adapted their behavior, becoming even more wary and difficult to ambush. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the Great Emu War was not going according to plan. The soldiers, despite expending thousands of rounds of ammunition, had killed far fewer emus than anticipated. The birds, far from being decimated, seemed to be thriving, their numbers undiminished and their behavior even more brazen. Major Meredith, forced to admit defeat, withdrew his men from the field. The first campaign of the Great Emu War had ended in failure, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the emu, and a humbling reminder that even the most well-equipped army can be outmaneuvered by an enemy that refuses to fight by the rules. News of the Army's initial setbacks in the Great Emu War spread like wildfire, fueled by a media eager for a sensational story. The public, initially amused by the notion of soldiers battling birds, began to question the government's handling of the situation. Cartoons depicting hapless soldiers outwitted by emus appeared in newspapers across the country. Politicians, sensing an opportunity to score points against their opponents, jumped on the bandwagon, criticizing the cost of the operation and the perceived incompetence of the military. The government, caught between mounting pressure to resolve the EMU crisis and the growing embarrassment of the Army's struggles, faced a difficult dilemma. Despite the public ridicule and political pressure, the Australian government, determined to salvage some semblance of victory from the Great Emu War, authorized a second military campaign against the emus. Major Meredith, his pride stung by the earlier setbacks, returned to the field, reinforced with additional troops, ammunition, and a steely determination to prove the Army's mettle. However, the emus, far from being intimidated by the renewed military presence, continued their guerrilla tactics, their movements as unpredictable, their defenses as frustratingly effective as before. The soldiers, despite their best efforts, found themselves once again engaged in a frustrating and seemingly unwinnable war of attrition. Recognizing the futility of their earlier tactics, Major Meredith and his men attempted to adapt to the emus' unconventional warfare. They mounted Lewis guns on the backs of trucks, hoping to chase down the birds and overcome their speed advantage. However, the rough terrain and the emus' erratic movements made accurate shooting from a moving vehicle nearly impossible. They tried herding the emus into ambushes, but the birds, their senses keenly attuned to danger, often scattered before the trap could be sprung. The soldiers, despite their ingenuity and determination, found themselves constantly one step behind their avian adversaries. As the second campaign dragged on, the toll on the soldiers' morale and the government's resources became increasingly apparent. The men, weary of the constant chase, the frustrating lack of progress, and the relentless ridicule from the press and public, began to question the very purpose of their mission. The government, facing mounting criticism over the cost of the operation and the diminishing returns, found itself in an increasingly untenable position. The Great Emu War, once a minor nuisance, had become a political liability. In December 1932, with the emu threat still very real and the public growing increasingly weary of the whole affair, the Australian government made a strategic decision. They declared victory and withdrew the army from the field. Major Meredith, in his final report, claimed to have killed nearly 1,000 emus, a figure disputed by many who witnessed the campaign firsthand. The Great Emu War, though officially over, had left an indelible mark on the Australian psyche. It stood as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of nature, a humbling reminder that even the most technologically advanced military force can be outmaneuvered by an enemy that refuses to play by the rules. And perhaps most importantly, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the enemy, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant they may appear. The Australian Army's departure did not signal the end of the emu problem. In fact, with the threat of Lewis guns gone, the emus seemed to multiply, their numbers swelling as they continued their annual migrations across the Western Australian wheat belt. Farmers, their hopes for a decisive military victory dashed, watched in dismay as the birds continued to feast on their crops and trample their fences. The Great Emu War, despite its official designation as a military campaign, had ultimately been a stalemate. The emus, their nomadic lifestyle and natural resilience making them difficult targets, had effectively won by simply outlasting their human adversaries. The farmers, their pleas for help ignored and their livelihoods still under threat, were left to face the emu menace largely on their own. The failure of the military solution forced the Australian government and the farmers to rethink their approach to the emu problem. A new strategy emerged, one focused on containment rather than eradication. The construction of emu-proof fences became a priority, with the government providing funding and resources to help farmers protect their land. These fences, made of sturdy wire mesh and stretching for miles across the countryside, were designed to keep the emus out of agricultural areas, limiting their access to crops and water sources. While not a perfect solution, the fences proved to be a far more effective and sustainable method of emu control than the earlier attempts at military intervention. The Great Emu War may have ended in 1932, but the emu threat lingered, flaring up periodically in the decades that followed. Droughts, habitat loss, and the emus' own natural resilience ensured their continued presence on the Australian landscape, and their occasional forays into agricultural areas served as a reminder of the delicate balance between man and nature. Farmers, their memories of the Great Emu War still fresh, continued to lobby the government for assistance in controlling the emu population. However, the political appetite for another military campaign against birds had waned considerably. The Great Emu War, once a source of national embarrassment, had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the unintended consequences of human intervention in the natural world. In the absence of large-scale military intervention, the Australian government resorted to more localized and arguably less glamorous methods of emu control. Bounty systems, introduced in the 1920s, were expanded, offering financial incentives to farmers and professional shooters to cull emu numbers. Farmers armed with rifles and shotguns once again found themselves on the front lines of the emu conflict, their actions a testament to the enduring challenge of coexisting with a creature that refused to be easily controlled. The smell of gunpowder once again hung in the air, a reminder that the Great Emu War, though officially over, had left an enduring legacy on the Australian landscape. The Great Emu War, despite its seemingly absurd premise and its ultimate lack of a clear victor, has secured a unique place in Australian history and folklore. It is a story often told with a mix of humor and embarrassment, a cautionary tale about the hubris of man and the resilience of nature. Over the years, the Great Emu War has been the subject of countless books, articles, songs, and even a feature film. It has become a cultural touchstone, a symbol of Australian ingenuity and resilience, and a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, there is always a story to be told, a lesson to be learned, and perhaps even a laugh to be had. The Great Emu War, though fought nearly a century ago, continues to tickle the collective funny bone of Australia and the world. It stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of conflict, a reminder that even the most well-equipped armies can be humbled by adversaries they underestimate. The emus, those feathered giants of the outback, defied the might of the Australian military, demonstrating a cunning and resilience that belied their seemingly comical appearance. The war, though ultimately a failure in its primary objective of emu eradication, yielded valuable lessons about the importance of adaptability, the limits of military force in the face of unconventional adversaries, and the enduring power of nature's will to survive. It highlighted the often comical clash between human ambition and the realities of the natural world. The Great Emu War, though often relegated to the footnotes of history books, serves as a potent reminder that truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. It is a story that captures the imagination, sparks debate, and continues to generate laughter and head-shaking wonder. The emus, those unyielding denizens of the outback, remain a potent symbol of Australia's wild heart, a reminder that some battles are best left unfought, and that true victory sometimes lies in learning to coexist with the untamed forces that shape the land.